So many of us spend a lot of time with music blaring in our ears. Whether it's Spotify, YouTube, or the radio, we're used to having music constantly at our fingertips, perfectly curated for any mood.
But for most of human history, this wasn't the case. So, what did we do before we had continuous access to music on demand? How did people experience music? What instruments did they play? And how important was it to their daily lives?
Well, let's take a journey back through time and find out. I'm Ollie.
And I'm Matt, and this is What We Did Before, the podcast where we chart the history of modern inventions.
Helping us explore what we did before music is Steve Pretty, band leader of the Hackney Colliery Band and host of the Origin of the Pieces podcast.
Steve takes us right back through time to learn about some of the first musical instruments invented by humans and how music may even predate language.
And he brings us right up to the present, where we discuss the first recorded music and the advent of AI songs. If you're enjoying what we're doing, please subscribe to the channel. It helps us out massively. Now, on to Steve. Steve Pretty, it is an absolute pleasure having you on the podcast. It's so great to have you here because I first heard about you from New Scientists podcast, which I produce. You came on and you briefly touched on the origins of music. And I say briefly because you were also playing a conch at the time, which took up quite a lot of the airtime, of course, as it should. But I just thought there's so much more to explore about the origins of music and how, I guess, humanity got introduced to it and why it's important to us. So what for you are some of the most fascinating and perhaps counterintuitive ancient instruments our ancestors played?
It's a really good question. I think what's so interesting, I think, about how music would have existed back in the day is actually it's got a lot in common with how it exists now, in that we would have used things that were around us, right? We would have used the materials that were available to us now. So if you're watching the podcast, you can see I'm in a studio full of toys, synths, and recording stuff, and I'm a trumpet player, so trumpets and all sorts of electronics and brass instruments and all sorts of things. But that we're able to do that now because over time we have worked on and learned ways of adapting metal, harnessing electricity to make noise, all those things. But really, it's the same story as our ancient ancestors would have had with what they had around them. So yeah, sure, they couldn't work metal in the same way, but they could have that same conch you mentioned here. They could find a shell on a beach, and then presumably they would have eaten the contents, and then they would pick it up. Then maybe they would hit it. They would play around with it, and then eventually over time they would find new ways of playing with it. Probably like many things in music, even today, it happened by happy accident that someone just picked it up and played it in a certain way, because you can't just blow into. Well, first you have to cut the end off a shell to play it. You then need to blow it in a particular way. You can't just blow it. You need to vibrate your lips in a certain way to get that sound. I like to talk about the story of musical history as a story of human ingenuity and creativity, and the story of musical instruments really being the story of music technology, which sounds quite niche, and you think, oh, that's just about synths or recording gear or whatever, but really it is about humans harnessing the natural world to create tools of expression. And the more ways we have of harnessing the natural world, the more different ways we have of expressing ourselves. And so I think that's that kind of confluence of things is really important. So in terms of some examples, of course, the shell is something I'm very interested in, partly because as a trumpet player, it's a kind of proto trumpet. That of course there's all sorts of different instruments, and there's things like the flutes, the Neolithic flutes, which have been found 40 to 50,000 years ago in caves, made from bird bones. The problem, of course, is a lot of things won't have survived, right? So when we're talking about any of this stuff, most of the time when we're talking about prehistory, it's conjecture, especially when you're talking about a culture. Who knows how they would have been singing, or how they would have would they've been playing rocks or whatever that there's no evidence for anymore, or other things that would have degraded over time. So we have things like shells or bone flutes, or because they they last. So that doesn't necessarily mean that they're the earliest things. And you've got to imagine that particularly something like a bone flute, which is a bit more sophisticated than a shell, because it's got holes in that would be a bit particular places to create particular tones. So that would have taken like iteration, and that would have taken experimentation and work on one design, and then thinking, actually maybe that doesn't work, let's get another bone, try that. So that's the thing. You can only imagine that would be quite an advanced stage of musical experimentation. Surely there would have been a lot of stuff that happened before that we can't necessarily know about, but those sorts of things certainly we do know about, and they date back 40,000-50,000 years. There are also things called aerophones, which are can be things that you whirl. So you may have seen Aboriginal people in Australia and other places still use some of those things that create a kind of drone in the air by swinging something around your head. So there's all sorts of interesting ways that people have created sound and for different purposes. But again, I think I like to think about that as a progression, and we're still doing that now. People making electronics now, or making new violins or whatever it might be, a part of that story that has existed for as long as we have, pretty much. The fact that I love about the flute, even as being one of the oldest designed musical instruments, is that we've only been making bread. We've only been cultivating wheat for probably less than 5,000 years, and we've been making flutes, actually sort of complicated flutes, these tools of musical expression, for probably 50,000 years. So it's sort of an extraordinary history in that sense.
It does definitely demonstrate that music has been so important, not just a hobby for humans, but a really important part of culture for humans for a very, very long time, even more important than bread. And actually, when you talk about the ancient instruments and what you can and can't find, we see examples in the wild of chimps drumming on trees, which hints at something musical, or perhaps they have some sort of reverence or awe for nature, for the trees, whatever it is. They're using the environment as an instrument. And for that, you would never be able to tell whether humans had been banging on the bases of trees to try to make drumming sounds through the forest, because there's not going to be archaeological evidence of that. But that's not to say that we weren't doing things. I think of a band like Pentatonics and the fact that they can produce incredible sounds purely a cappella. And you can imagine ancient humans relying purely on their vocal cords as well for some of their musicality. Well,
certainly, I think that would have long predated the design of instruments. Would be using your voice or using percussion to explore some of these things. Of course, you can't place when any of those things happened. But one of the important things, I think, and where some of these questions, I think, can cross over and it's just a very complicated picture, of course, because you're talking about an enormously complex thing that happened all over the world. Firstly, I think it probably happened in lots of different places in lots of different times. So there's not necessarily one story for how it all happened. But it's not like, for example, I know you're doing an episode on chocolate and the cacao. Like, that is about a geographical region where that plant is grown. Music is something that can exist with or without instruments and can kind of spring up anywhere in the world. So the real question is why and how people adapted whatever their environment was to create that music. One of the important things to think about is the function of music, and I think or rather the different functions that music can play. So when we're talking about things like vocal music or percussion music, chimps drumming on trees or whatever, that can function on several different levels. Maybe it was for communication, maybe then it started as a communicative tool that then kind of evolved into and got adapted into something that was more conventionally musical, that we would think of as more conventionally musical now. In other words, something that is done for expressive purposes. But music can play all these different roles. I think one of the fault lines with how we think about music a lot of the time in today's culture is that music is there for entertainment, which it is. That's, of course, a very, very important role that music plays, but it plays all sorts of different roles, and it has throughout our history as a species. It's played many, many different roles, and one of those, an important one, but not the only one, is entertainment. But I think it's important but before we kind of dig into some of the weeds of this stuff, that we think about those different roles that music can play, as well as the different tools that it played. Because things like, even coming back to things like shells, they would have been used as instruments of communication, of war, even, like shell trumpets, and instruments of ritual, as well as probably instruments of entertainment. So, that they kind of, there's often not one answer to these things, I think.
These days, we have very good access to music, obviously. There's not a day that goes by where I think I'm not exposed to it in some way, whether it's sort of by choice on Spotify or just going into a shop or walking past somebody who's got a radio on or playing music in their car. And we're sort of all consuming it largely for entertainment. And I know that we've sort of already said that it can be quite sort of speculative, but for early humans, how was music kind of consumed? Do you think that entertainment was something that sprung up later and it was largely used kind of functionally, or what purposes do you think? How was it different back then?
I think, really often I imagine what we're talking about is something that's not really definable in the ways that we think of those different roles that music has now. So now, for example, we wouldn't necessarily think of liturgical music in a church as entertainment, but we think of that as a sort of ceremonial music, as opposed to going to a rave. We don't think of that as ceremonial, but I think the lines are a lot more blurry than that. I would argue even now, to be honest, I would argue, without being too reductive, there is a case to be made for things like raves or whatever, about that taps into our ancient past. It's, trance music, for example. We know music called trance now, but like the trance state is a very, very important element of lots of musical cultures, dating back certainly thousands of years, if not much, much further. And so I think there would have been a lot of crossover between those forms.
Well, even the shared musical experience of just going to a gig or going to a festival, joining in a mosh pit. If it really was the case that all we used music for was entertainment, we'd be happy just to listen to it in our headphones. But actually, we have this yearning to go and experience it with other people.
Exactly that. Yeah, exactly. And I think in answer to that question of how it would have been then compared to now, I think there's a lot of commonality with now, actually, but I think it's just that we think about it in quite a different way now, because I think it would have been a much more collective experience, right? So the separation that we have between audience and performer now is something that I think is a relatively modern invention, and it's something that, as an aside, on a personal level, I'm very, very keen to slightly break down and to sort of make the case that audiences are really, really important, active part of what any interesting musical performance should be. That's not to say that every show needs like big audience interaction or whatever, but that audiences, and there's a kind of synchronicity between audiences and performers at their best that makes for a very special thing that can only really happen live. And we can come on to recorded music later, but I think that live experience was very, very important now, and certainly was back then. But also I think, of course, it would have been tied very much to the natural world. It would have been tied to a sense of place. So again, if you're thinking about coming back to the shell again, or the flutes, these have been found in caves mainly. And the interesting thing about shells is that they were and are used in, for example, the Himalaya, and this is in very much inland, in the Himalaya. So all these shells would have been brought from the coastline, hundreds or thousands of miles away, up into the mountains, into caves, into these very resonant spaces. I often talk about the shells when if I play them at festivals and things. Sometimes I sort of run them through electronics and create these. I have the project called Shellelectronica, but I do that partly because I'm trying to tap into that ancient form of how people would have experienced music in very resonant spaces, right? So if I just pick up a shell and play it at an outdoor festival on an outdoor stage, then you'll hear it, but even with just a normal microphone on, you'll hear it. But then hasn't got much sustain on it. So when I stop playing, it stops. The example I use is that I was lucky enough to record some of these shells in the Natural History Museum, overnight one night a couple of years ago, and just one note on one of these shells made the person I was with cry, just like one, and whereas if I played that same note now, just, oh yeah, it's like a loud note on a shell, fine. But because the resonance of that space and the kind of the quiet of the room and the particular way that space picked up and resonated and amplified the note that I was playing on that shell, that sudden, the element of sort of sound design, the space that was played in was really, really important. And I suspect that would have been at least as important as it is now to our ancient ancestors. So it's, perhaps we're not talking about such complex melodies or harmony or whatever, but the sense of place or occasion would have really changed the notes that they were playing, would have really changed the feeling of them. There's some evidence, for example, in some caves where there is a particularly unusual sound reflections. So in that one spot, you'd be playing a flute or even a drum or whatever here, and because the reverb or the delay off the cave walls would come back at you, you could basically play a kind of duet with yourself, by standing here. And so that's kind of what I try and tap into with my own stuff now. Yes, I'm using electronics, but I'm sort of trying to make the case that really it is something quite ancient, because I'm essentially using electronics to do that, to try and tap into that ancient experience that we would have had, and that feeling that, yes, these things were alive. There was something. This is, the house to a creature beforehand. But then you put them in a particular space, and that space creates something very different than if you just played them elsewhere. So I think the experience of music would have been much more tied to place and time and nature than it is now.
When you're describing it, I can kind of feel in a way in my body how that experience of listening to the music with the reverb in a cave may have been. It might sound a bit silly, but in a very different but sort of similar vein, the sound of silence recorded by Disturbed, for some reason that hits me like that. It's got like this massive, like, it's like a pressure builder. It's like a pressure cooker, building up. You get this really slow incline, and then his voice just cracks just as it's getting near to the end of the song. And something about it is quite moving, emotional, and you can imagine in a cave surrounded by your tribe. It's a way of connecting really deeply and really emotionally without ever having to say a word. I guess this sort of points to the fact that caves were a moment of awe, wonder, maybe even divine power for our ancient ancestors. Are there any other sort of sites of particular interest in regards to locations where music would have been played in this way?
I think something that is interesting to think about when we are talking about where music would have been played is how much people traveled as well, and the fact that these instruments were portable, and if we were a nomadic people, we would have the instruments and tools of ritual or expression would have been they would needed to be portable. So people, I'm sure, would have been playing them wherever, and then finding places that felt like they were particularly significant. Again, there are a few sites of things like standing stones where there's some evidence that, again, the sound reflections are particularly interesting, and that seems unlikely to be a coincidence. So, there's a few things like that which either would have been constructed by our ancestors, or they would have adapted existing spaces. Wherever music would have been performed, I think it's this idea, you just tapped on something quite important there, I think, about that sound of silence, where I think of these things as ways of expressing ourselves that we can't really do in other ways. There's something very kind of visceral and pure about music. I love music with lyrics, but the thing that I'm particularly interested in is what I call abstract music, like tools of abstract expression, in other words, musical instruments, because I think the picture gets a bit muddier once you start talking about lyrics, just because obviously there's a sort of imposed meaning once lyrics are involved. But I think there's something about music without lyrics that just pure sound that can have that effect. So like the crack of a voice or any of those things. And it's because human emotions are really complicated. We are sentient beings. As far as we know, we're the only species that can kind of understand in some way or other our own place in the world, our own mortality. We need to be able to express that. The kind of human condition is extremely complex and isn't as simple as happy or sad, or the way that words can sometimes describe things. So I think music has got that ability to really zero in on expressing something that is very, very hard to describe in other ways. And so I think that's, again, when you're talking about where these instruments were played, as you were just saying, like that there would have been a moment where that would have felt like you were somehow in dialogue with nature, because again, you're using the natural world. Whatever you're playing, probably something has died, either because or incidentally to it. So whether it's a shell which had a conch in, or an animal hide drum, or string, guts from an animal that are being used as strings. It's quite brutal, really, that when you're creating a lot of these instruments, it would have been really tied to our how integrated we were with nature, and again, crossing that sort of slightly grey area between ritual and performance and enjoyment and entertainment, and and gradually I think these things branched off, but probably it was a lot less definable back in the day.
One thing that really interests me that you just touched on is kind of, firstly, this ability to communicate without language, and secondly, the link to nature and animals. So, birds sing. I've seen videos where, I've seen a video of like a blind elephant being played. Someone's playing piano and it's like captivated and swaying to the music. People playing like trumpets to cows, and they all come over and they genuinely look like they're just infatuated with this. And it seems quite clear that for humans, at least, this predates language as like a form of communication.
Well, there are a couple of schools of thought on this, and just again in my non-academic way, try and summarize them. And one of which is Steven Pinker, the sort of evolutionary biologist, coined this term auditory cheesecake when he was talking about music, which essentially was like, it's nice. Cheesecake's nice. It's nice to have, but you don't need it. So it's like it's a kind of nice thing that humans evolved, but it's not. It wasn't a kind of fundamental part of who we are. So that's like one and very, very prominent school of thought. Of course, many people, musicians and music lovers, were quite offended by that. Not offended, but we're a bit taken aback by that. And I'm very prepared if the evidence is there for that, then I like scientific thinking, so fair enough. But I do think there's also a very strong case on the other side, which has been made a lot by a lot of other evolutionary biologists and others, which is the case that really music is, as you suggest, a kind of proto language, is something that either co-evolved with language or predates language. Again, if you think about what's called motherese, which is the way we talk to babies, a lot of people talk to babies, which is in a very musical way. You're using. So of course, even when we're talking, if we stop this interview now and went back, I could transcribe this into music, because my voice and all of our voices are pitched. So, as I'm talking like this, I could write, this is a pitch. And as I go down here, it's, it's all pitched. And so it's just that we're using it in a different way. We're like, it's not anything fundamentally different between how we talk and how we sing or make music, or in a pitched way like that. So I think there's a lot to be said for that idea that mothers and babies and parents and babies, like that bond that they have when they're talking to each other like that, is something that's quite ancient. And that again, that I think it's often a mistake to think of music and language as totally separate. If you think of them as sort of branches of the same thing that only later got kind of codified into this is that. That's the way I tend to try and think about music. And again, there's quite a lot of evidence for that as far as I'm aware, that they kind of the branching off is a relatively modern concept, and actually there's a lot to be said for the fact that our musical brains are in some sense more primal than our linguistic brains, because they tap into something more immediate. I mean, I recently in my podcast interviewed a music therapist who works with dementia patients, and of course, people talk a lot about the use of music in those cases where tunes from that person's youth, they can hum these tunes and they can remember these tunes, and it connects with them. Just the tunes, not the words, even connects with them in a way that even non-verbal people can kind of really engage with just a few notes on a piano. And so I think there is something deep in our brain, I think in our evolutionary past that has those musical roots. And as to other animals, again, I mean, as far as we know, no other animals make music in the way that we think of music. In other words, that is, again, there's lots of different uses of music. One of them is communication. So birds obviously use music in that sense, but in the way that we're talking about music mainly, so entertainment, things like ritual, there's I don't think there's a lot of evidence, at least yet, for the fact that other animals use it like that. That's not to say that they haven't got the capacity to want to hear it and to be intrigued by it, because I think there is something interesting about it, because it is ordered sound basically in some form that just sets the neurons firing and gets, whether we're humans or or other animals, can kind of lock into that and go, oh, that's interesting, and you get that little burst of dopamine that you get from kind of hearing patterns. Or I'm sure that different degrees of that exist in other animals.
Yeah, you don't get birds sitting around a campfire with one of them just whistling Wonderwall for the 10th time.
No, exactly. Exactly.
And actually, I can totally see that this kind of boundary between, I guess, well, if we just look at singing and speaking, it's a pretty blurred line, actually, isn't it? Like you said, you can find pitch in anything, right? So it's like, where does the line from I'm talking to, oh, actually, I'm singing now, where is that line? And I'm kind of wondering, do we have any evidence as to sort of when humans gained the ability to sing, wherever that sits on this imaginary line, and sort of control their voices in that way?
I mean, as far as I'm aware, we don't really. And the reason for that is that it's very hard to do any archaeological work on that, I think, or and any evolutionary work even, really, because we're talking about something that would have happened a very long time ago, probably hundreds of thousands of years ago, in our history. So there's an interesting book called the Singing Neanderthal. It's been a while since I've read that, so I'm not going to be able to remember too much from it. But certainly one of the cases it makes was that Neanderthals were singing and were making music. So we're talking back a really quite a long way back into our ancient past. And again, if you're talking about singing, there's lots of that's a bit more adaptive than a lot of other musical stuff, right? In other words, being able to control your voice, to be able to project it over long distances, probably quite helpful. Being able to change the pitch of it to be able to either to be heard or to, for whatever reason, as a kind of evolutionary advantage to show off to mates or whatever might be. There's probably kind of a strong case for that. The reason I'm particularly interested in the development of instruments, and again, these what I call tools of abstract expression, is that is something that is much more conscious. I think that is, if you excuse the pun, that is something that is much more deliberate, that you would have to pick something up, to think, have the idea to think, I'm going to make a nice sound out of this for a reason that I'm not sure, I can't really articulate, but pick it up, go, oh, okay, do that, fiddle with that, drill it, bash a hole there, knock the end off there, blow it in, it's that way, it doesn't work, okay, kind of keep trying like that. And of course, people would have been doing that with their voices, but we've got no way of really telling with voices, but B, you're using your voice all the time probably anyway to communicate, and so there's like a lot more of a blurred line between singing and speaking, whereas the actual kind of construction of a musical instrument, of this tool of expression, is a lot more sort of definite, if you like. It's not like someone has had the idea to do that, and that is the kind of, for me, is the kind of birth of this idea that we're doing this for a reason, and that's where it's much less clear as to what, like, the evolutionary reason behind that is. What's the evolutionary reason behind spending probably many hours making a bird bone flute? That's a lot more unclear, I think, whereas voice, because we're using it in all sorts of other ways, is a bit more defined, if you like.
You said that you spoke to somebody, I think, who has been working with dementia patients. And I've seen some things like this before, where there's a guy called Clive Waring who has a very, very short-term memory, but you put him in front of a piano and he's just perfectly playing the things that he learnt sort of 30 or 40 years ago, even though he doesn't really remember. I've noticed, just obviously totally different scale, but when I pick up a guitar and I haven't played for a while, I haven't played a song, my fingers seem to know what to do, but I don't consciously remember. Like I shouldn't remember how to play this song. I was wondering if you have any thoughts on why or how this kind of like unconscious part of our brain seems to be able to hold on to music in ways that maybe our conscious can't remember, kind of things in life that have happened, if that makes sense.
I think it's partly coming back to what we were just saying, really, about the fact that, that our musical brains possibly predate our linguistic brains in some ways, and there is something more, somehow more ancient about that part of our brain, in the sense that it taps into the emotional center that is not tied to language, right? So, firstly, when it comes to being moved by music that you hadn't thought about for years. An example for me, slightly quirky example for me, right, is that I have a strange car. I've got like a sort of minivan that is a Japanese import, right, and it came with it. If it's from 2006, it came with a mini disc player in it, and I'm of a vintage where I was big into mini discs as a teenager, right, as a sort of late teenager, early 20s. So I'm still hoping the mini disc will come back one day, but anyway, I still had loads of my old mini discs. Right now, these are records, albums I haven't listened to for 25 years, if not more. And I thought, I'll put it in as I was going a long drive, and because that was the age. So again, I'm a trumpet player and play a lot of jazz, and particularly then when I was at my late teens, I was getting really into playing jazz and practicing a lot and stuff. And I could sing every note of some of these, like sax solos or trumpet solos that I haven't listened to or thought about in any way for at least 25 years. And I could literally sing every note of the solo still. And, that, I think there's a couple of things there that is sort of embedded in a different way than learning a speech or whatever, which, often goes in one ear out the other. So that's kind of embedded in a different part of my brain somehow than other memories are. But also when it comes to actually doing it on an instrument, what you're talking about, I think the process of actually making music, playing music, or particularly playing music when you've got technique, it's a muscle memory thing there again, which is something that's slightly different, I think, from a kind of conscious memory, because it's you learn by doing. And I think again, something that's often underpriced when we're thinking about conceptualizing music is how the importance of physicalizing music, like how embodied music is, and that's the fact that that's how we learn it, and that's how it's kind of encoded in our brains. And so one of the things I do when I'm doing things like masterclasses is I get people to like walk and clap, right, do things, physical things, and often these are very experienced musicians. Like, for example, I've done masterclasses with like the Household Cavalry Band, the army band, and get a bunch of big army folk doing that stuff can feel a bit childish, but actually it teaches you something really, really important about rhythm and about understanding your stomps that's on the beat and your claps are off, and then you can start physicalizing it in that way. And so I think the same thing is true when you're playing the song on guitar. The sort of muscle memory of it can be there without it being conscious. And in fact, what happens quite a lot is the moment it goes wrong, if I'm like, for example, trying to remember a song, the moment it goes wrong is when I do try and think about it, and I'm sort of on. You've got this sort of you're like, what am I doing? And then it's gone, because it's sort of overriding your instinctive musical brain with your and physical brain with your conscious brain, which is too bad at remembering things, whereas the kind of musical brain is encodes things in a different way. It's one of the reasons, by the way, that I think we often learn important bits of information set to music, the alphabet song, or that's when people are trying to remember stuff, they use songs like that. But also the way that bards, for example, Homer or these ancient bards back in the ancient world would have been singing. That they call epic poetry songs a lot of the time, and it would have been definitely accompanied by music. A lot of that stuff, if not sung entirely, then certainly music would have played an important role in that. And there's a strong argument for that being because it was a way of remembering, a 50,000 line piece of epic poetry was to remember it to music.
Memory and music it goes even deeper, because there is research to show that if you learn and maintain your learning of a musical instrument, as you age, you reduce your risk of getting dementia.
Mm-hmm.
So there's something incredible there about the link between memory and music, which is actually has a physical effect on your brain as well and how it ages.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's because music, like the practice of actually playing a musical instrument is it works so many different aspects of your brain. It works that, the motor skills, fine motor skills. For me, again, as a brass player, it's really made me very conscious of things like breathing, breath control, and so there's aspects of that which I'm sure are related to better health outcomes, although I think being a trumpet player is probably not related to better health outcomes based on the longevity of most trumpet players, but still. But I think there is, there's a lot of, it's working lots of different parts of your brain, both consciously and subconsciously. This is sort of slightly a slight tangent, but like over a couple of years, particularly over lockdown, I had a little electronic drum kit that I just use for like composing a bit, and I sort of, right, I'm gonna play for like 5-10 minutes every day just to try and get some basic skills. And day one, it's embarrassing having been a professional musician for many years, and you're trying to go dung gung, like the most basic drum
playing Coldplay.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And it just wasn't working. The coordination of the four limbs just wasn't there at all. Really, I was just like, how is this possible that I can't get this together? But then something really interesting happened. The next day, I come in and I can do it straight away. I'm not saying I was immediately a great drummer, but I could do the simple thing I was trying to do the day before, I could then suddenly do. And it's because, you practice, you stop, your brain sort of processes it, and then you come back and you're able to do it. And that's how you progress, like, on an instrument. It's just that, again, slowly, like iteratively practicing things.
Well, I think it's a good connection actually to the past, because it shows that you mentioned about the iterative process of designing an instrument, or even coming up with the fact that you could chop off a bit of the conch and start playing it with a funny sort of mouth shape. It speaks to, I suppose, the fortitude of our ancient ancestors, that they were willing to put in time to something that seemed basically impossible at first. The first time an ancient human would have tried playing a conch, it would have been like, oh, that does nothing. Yeah. And yet there was this sort of drive to go, no, I do think that this could make a sound which is pleasant. So I think that does kind of talk to how our ancient ancestors, what we have to thank them for, really. And something you did mention was the bard, which I really wanted to pick up on, because my image of the bard is, I don't know if you've seen The Witcher.
I haven't, but I'm aware of it, yeah.
Yeah, so it's like a sort of traveling companion who just sings songs about your great feats to you, which I'm imagining wasn't necessarily how bards were in reality. But I kind of like this idea of a bard back in historic times being your version of Spotify that you sort of just took with you. But obviously you discussed how music would have been a collective activity a lot, involving, multiple members of a tribe. But do you think, the idea of a solo musician is quite a new invention, and would people have had like bards in, frequently in different locations that were singing music a lot? Or do you think experiencing music would have happened less frequently for our ancestors?
I suspect that experiencing music would have been very, very common for most people, and experiencing music, but not in the way that we think of now, not necessarily in the way that, you obviously not in the way that you go to a concert or a gig, but more in the way that it will be a part of everyday life in some way or other, right? Probably everyone would play a bit of music or sing a bit, or, so I think a lot about how the idea of a professional musician is relatively modern concept, and it's existed, for the last few hundred years, and maybe a bit longer. But really, musicians pretty much for the whole of human history have been not a professional class like that. So there'll be people who do lots of things, and so it's interesting now. I think about it now when I work with people who are a bit bashful about the fact they've got other jobs or whatever. They're like, "Oh, I'm not a real musician, I do this," or "I'm a music teacher, but I do some gigs and things." Like, no, you're still a musician. Like, you just don't you don't earning 100% of your living purely from playing or writing music. It is a relatively modern invention, and I think it would have been much more part of people's everyday life, and in fact, still is in cultures that are not so engaged in, if you like, kind of the modern world and of capitalism and commerce and everything, or even, to be fair, even things like Irish pubs, like jams like that. I'm really fascinated. I talk a lot on my podcast to people who are in those worlds as much as I do professional musicians. I hope that's certainly what I aspire to try and talk to people who are doing like trad folk jams, and something like a traditional Irish or Scottish folk jam, or also exists in places like Appalachia. That those are much more collective ideas. You turn up with an instrument, someone has an idea. Oh, well, should we do this reel? Yeah, and then they start playing it, and maybe everyone knows it, maybe they don't. They're working out as they go a bit, and then someone else has another idea, and you sort of follow that. It's a lot more about a kind of community event, but also, very importantly, my kind of again mission with the podcast and a lot of stuff that I'm doing is that it is as much about listening as it is about performing. And I think that is where, even as non-performers, if you like, as non-instrumentalists or singers, we can really deepen our musicality. Something I'm like super passionate about is trying to help people listen like a musician, hear like a musician, and by which I mean just like active listening, and this idea of knowing when to be on broadcast mode and when to be on receive mode. And I think something like a trad jam, or to an extent a jazz jam, or an open mic, or any of those things are really interesting cultural examples of that exist now. But I think that our earlier ancestors would have been much more like that. So yes, there might be, maybe there's a shaman or someone who is leading certain aspects of the ritual. Maybe there's someone who is, the kind of the main driver behind certain things, or the person who's come up with certain rhythms, or whatever it might be. But really, it's a much more of a group activity for the most part. And so I think the idea of like solo musicians is relatively new as far as I'm aware, and by new I mean many hundreds of years old, rather than tens or hundreds of thousands of years old. So yeah, I think it's as music gets more delineated into it's being its own thing, if you like, rather than just being a part of everyday life and society, that's where we start finding specialists, basically. In a sense, that's been amazing because that's really driven the development of music. But I think I do sometimes think we're in danger of having lost something if we focus too much on that bit and not enough on the rest of the history of music. And so, I'm quite passionate about not losing that specialist. It's very important to have people who've dedicated their lives to really, making amazing music, but to try and bring people with you rather than just putting them on a pedestal and saying, this musical genius who no one can ever touch, or no one must ever compare themselves to. There are those people. There are a few of those people, but really, music for me is much more of a participatory thing, even as a listener.
I feel like we say this at least once per episode, but damn capitalism! That's that's why you get superstars, isn't it?
yeah, exactly. And and that's great. But that is, again, if we think about the different functions of music, I think that's where that is music as entertainment. That's music as commerce, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's the function of that music, is to entertain a particular demographic in a particular way for that thing. If you take like the kind of commercialized pop star model, great, all power to them. But like that's the function of that. That doesn't mean that other music isn't successful or valid or whatever. Like that, a successful pop star is someone who makes lots of money and makes songs that everyone streams and downloads and and dances to in their kitchen or whatever. Fine, but you can be successful in music in all sorts of ways that don't look like that. So I think again, this is a whole other discussion really, but like music and commerce can very much coexist, but depending on what the function of that music is, and you never commercializing Irish folk music in that is there to be designed to be played in a pub is. Well, actually, that's a bad example because Ed Sheeran's basically done that, hasn't he?
He has, yeah. I was going to say.
Well, yeah. I mean, that's an example of someone who has taken a community tradition. I don't mean this as in any disrespect to Ed Sheeran, but like he's observed that thing and thought, I can do the pop star version of that, if you know what I mean. And fair play to him, he's done that. But like the reason that's interesting is that this is a kind of community thing that isn't about professionalizing the musical class. It's about like people just turning up with their instruments and jamming, some of whom, by the way, are absolutely amazing players. So it's not about whether they're great or not. That's not the point of it. The point is that it to be in the pub. And he's kind of gone, oh yeah, people like that. I'll take that and do the commercial thing with it, which he's done very well.
Well, before you say music's for everyone, you haven't heard the albums that Matt and I recorded when we were 18. So reserve judgment for now.
But again, it depends what the point of that is, right? If the point of that, of you making albums when you're 18 was to have fun and learn a bit about music and like bond as friends, then like job done. It doesn't need to have, you don't need to have had loads of downloads or sold loads of tickets to shows for that to have been a success.
Well, one of my most memorable experiences of being that age is just sitting in Matt's bedroom recording these ridiculous songs, to be fair, and maybe that's enough.
Well, that's enough. Sorry, just to, finally on that note, like I was talking on my podcast recently about the fact that on our phones, we're always messing around with cameras and filters and all those things, but we're not messing around with sound in quite the same way. And I think we've got the ability to do it, like phones, iPads, whatever, these things that everyone's got with them at all times. We're not doing that with sound because for some reason, even though there's hundreds of thousands of professional photographers in the world, but yet everyone's a photographer. Now that they've got a phone in their and a camera in their pocket. But we've also got a really very good recording device in their pocket, or a very good, little sound module or whatever it is. But people aren't messing around with it in quite the same way. And I find that quite interesting, and as to why that is. And I think it is partly because we put musicians on a kind of pedestal that we don't with photographers or filmmakers in quite the same way.
And one thing that you were saying before about sort of music being, or encouraging it to be kind of like this group activity and kind of the benefits of that. So it kind of got me thinking that one of the things actually as an amateur musician that puts me off about this is kind of like my lack of music theory knowledge. So, with musical notation and scales and chords and things, I was wondering if you sort of happen to know at which point roughly music started to become sort of more sophisticated, where we were applying these kind of rules to the music that we were playing.
One of the first things to say is that music theory is a way of describing what music does, and it's not a set of rules for what music must do. But it's also when people say, I never studied theory, music theory, what they mean is I didn't do, in the West, like grade 5 theory or whatever. I didn't study for my exams, my musical exams, and so I don't know anything about theory. But really, that is just a way of using language to describe what music does. Probably you do know a lot of the stuff that is contained in, you do know a lot of music theory, basically. If you're able to like play a guitar or sing, whatever, you may not be able to label what some of those things are. And, what music theory is a way of describing some of those things with some language, some specific language that you need to know. By the way, I think it's really a really good thing for most people to do, or like for people who want to take music seriously, to be able to read music and stuff is really, really helpful. So I'm absolutely not doing that down. And sometimes I think it can be in danger of being sort of over romanticized like when people can't do that, he's like, oh wow, it's amazing, he's a great musician even though he can't read music. It's like, well, those things are different. Those are different skills, but it really, music theory is also very, very culturally specific. So like, if you're thinking about music, the way that we're taught music theory in the kind of exam system here, that is very, very different from how for example, I studied a bit of tabla, Indian percussion in India, and there's a completely different system. I've worked with Indian musicians quite a lot. Completely different system of understanding rhythm and harmony and melody, like totally different in all sorts of ways. And then that's completely different again from like, gamelan music from Indonesia. So there's this idea that music theory is something that governs all music, and those are the laws. It's not, it's not the laws of physics. It's something that it's not describing a physical reality for the most part. It's describing what musicians have done over the ages in order to make music that we say is nice or that we like in certain ways. But a lot of the breakthroughs in music come when either people are consciously or unconsciously breaking some of those rules. A classic case in point is like the blues or jazz. I've spent a lot of time in New Orleans, and that's like kind of the iconic birthplace of jazz, because you had these Western classical traditions coexisting with the enslaved people's traditions from the Caribbean and from Africa, and obviously those are all very distinct cultures. Caribbean culture very different from African culture, West African culture very different from East African culture, but they're all there together, learning from each other, and that's where this new music is born, because people have got their own kind of music theory, Western classical music theory, West African drumming, which doesn't have a kind of codified music theory in the way that we have it with textbooks here, maybe, but it's very much got its own structure. But then they're all thrown together, and they'll kind of like go, oh wait, that's cool, let's try that, and that's when that's when something new is born. So that's the first thing I'd say. But then in terms of when it got more complicated, I mean, music's been, again, it depends what you mean by complicated, because certain rhythmic things in different parts of the world are extremely complicated, like much more complicated than the way we think of music in the West. Whereas like Western harmony, chords and scales and things, arguably much more kind of complicated, for better or worse, than in other parts of the world. So there's like, complexity can look like lots of different things, and those things happen at different times in different ways. There's a sort of simple answer to that, which is, things got codified in the kind of Western classical model relatively recently, really, in the last few hundred years. Western music theory doesn't really have a good way of describing for things like the blues scale, for example. Hasn't really got a good way of explaining what that is, because it's just a different thing. It comes, and so you can try, you can kind of try and fit it into a box where it's this and this and this, but it never quite fully describes it, because music is a lot more nuanced than that, and it actually it's not a set of rules that you go, there you go, that's music done properly. So I think people have got a lot more musical theory knowledge than they realise, basically.
I always remember hearing about how Simon and Garfunkel used the studio building that they were in to create some of the sounds on their track. Well, I don't know if it was on all of the tracks, but I particularly know it was on Bridge Over Troubled Water. With the studio, they were able to create like reverb using the stairwell, things like that. And I think this sort of goes back to your idea that we don't experiment with music anymore, or in the same way, or as we do with photography. And I think this is an amazing story here of like using your environment, like of musical ingenuity, really, before we had effects and before we had plugins. Do you think because we have all of these things now, these sort of digitized versions, that music or modern music tools have sort of flattened that older spirit of invention, and also kept people from feeling that they can be experimenters themselves?
So yeah, it's a very interesting question. I think it can do, certainly. I think there is an idea when you're making music on a computer where you can. It's insane how much it's democratized music making. For all the fact that I say people don't experiment with music in the way that they do with photos, there are more people than ever making music on composing music, and I think that's a great thing. And there are statistics about people, about was it 40,000 songs day or something, getting uploaded to Spotify. And that was before AI. That's like that's people just going, oh, there's a new song, and so whether or not they're getting listened to, again, I would say is beside the point. People are making music, and that's a great thing because it is more democratic than ever, because you can just do it even just on a phone, but you can certainly do it on a laptop. And when you've got insane level of tools that no one in musical history has ever had, just even on your phone. But I do think that there is a danger that it pushes you towards homogeneity. It pushes you towards doing the kind of right thing, or using the same preset as everyone else. Or when we're talking about things like what we call DAWs, digital audio workstations, so people might have heard of things like Logic or GarageBand or those sorts of things. There's a grid, right? So here's the bars, and even just when you open it up, it will open it up at a certain tempo, a certain speed. The tempo most DAWs open up at is 120 beats per minute, so it's like 2 every second, basically. So the amount of songs that are written at 120 BPM, I mean, it's a very common, it was even before these things existed, it was a very common sort of tempo for a lot of songs to be written at. But because it's now baked into where you open up your music software, and that's the tempo it starts at, so your idea starts at that speed, and and I think it pushes you into a certain direction, which I think you have to work quite hard sometimes to break away from. The thing that I find as a composer and producer and things is to try and preserve that sense of play. We call it playing music for a reason. It should be about play and about experimentation. Talking about Simon and Garfunkel using the stairwell. There's countless examples of that. John Bonham on in Led Zeppelin records, playing in a big stone stairwell. Another good example in drums is the kind of 80s drum sound that was discovered by accident. With Phil Collins, they left a channel up on a desk. They left a particular, like the mic that the producer uses to talk to the musicians was left open during the recording, and then they heard this mad drum sound. They're like, wow, what's that? And it was just because they accidentally left a mic open, and like that suddenly is the drum sound of the 80s. So there's all these sorts of things that happen by accident. And I think whenever I'm working with people, particularly less experienced people, who I think are worried about not getting it right. When you're first starting, like, I've got to do it all right, and I've got to make sure that this is right. And for me, a lot of the stuff that happens, a lot of the best stuff I've written, I think, or that the like choices I've made when I'm mixing a tune or something, is sometimes they'll come from happy accidents. To be able to leave a bit of space for things going slightly wrong, but then go, no, let's go with that. And the reason I think that's really important is that that's what happens in live music. Or it should. For me, I've realised as I've got older that the thing that I don't respond to that much in like live entertainment is anything too shiny. So anything that is like there is a set way of doing it, and it should be exactly the same every night. And if it's not that, something's gone wrong. Whereas if I'm going to see live gig, I don't want it to go wrong, but I want there to be a feeling that this is a thing that can happen in the room tonight, and it's going to be slightly different the next night. It doesn't need to be like a totally different show, but everyone's playing. There's a sense of like energy in the air where people are trying things out and experimenting a little bit, just at the edges of even something really polished. You can kind of push it a little bit more one night, or respond to the audience a bit in the next night, and that's what makes live entertainment exciting. And I think trying to carry that into when you're making music on a computer or whatever, trying to carry that sense of just playing around, seeing what happens. And we've got this amazing power now where you can play around and see what happens, and then if you want to, you can fix it afterwards. But what you can't do anywhere near as easily is inject that sense of experimentation and stuff afterwards. So you've got to get that.
To that point, I saw a mum on Instagram the other day playing Prison System by System of a Down purely in her toddler's playroom with instruments from within the playroom. Amazing. And it was just, that was the kind of musical ingenuity that I needed to see that day.
It's great. Well, it's interesting. I've been working on a kids show actually, and I've done a theme for a thing called My Friend Maisie, which is the Maisie Mouse Books TV show. And And actually, with that, when I got the pitch in for that, the first thing I did was go to my kids' like preschool music toys, and get them out and like lay them all out and record them and try and find ideas on them. And what's been interesting about that is that the theme tune I made for that, I made using some of those instruments and some other things, but I used a particular scale that is called the pentatonic scale, which is very, very well known across a lot of cultures, but is the scale that you find, for example, on kids' instruments and in kids' playgrounds even. So the whole theme is made from that and on kids' instruments. And what's quite nice about that is that you can then go back and play that in a playground, because it's just made through those instruments. And again, that sense of playfulness, I think, is really important for people to understand, whether they're writing music or whether they're just like listening to music as well, even, just trying to think, well, no one gets hurt if we play, play around. I do it with my band, Hackney Colliery Band. It's the thing I like doing most of all with that band, is surprising people in one direction or another. Yeah, if it's too sort of locked down and like this is what it is, then I think you're in danger of losing the kind of human aspect to music making.
Yeah, I think you've perfectly vocalized a number of things that I've been feeling over the last few years. So I love that, and it's been the reason why I've been able to get into music in a lot of ways, is how accessible, being able to have basically a recording studio in my room. I love that I can have access to all these effects, which maybe I wouldn't have been able to do. I can record at a better quality without having to have a massive, amp and mic setup that I couldn't afford maybe. But to that end, in my sort of genre of choice, which is metal, something that I've noticed as somebody going to gigs for the last sort of 15 years and listening to this music, is this pursuit of sort of perfection. And you can just go on YouTube and there are set ways of how to produce metal guitars, how to produce metal drums. Like, this is the correct way. And if something is produced a bit differently now, people pick up on it. And it's like you said in the Doors, you can perfectly have your drums on the tempo exactly, auto-tune things. When you listen to them live, they're playing to a click track, they have backing tracks. It all has to be very polished, it seems, a lot of the time. And it does feel actually like there's something missing, or that it's a little sterile, or we're not having the fun that we used to have, where there was this idea that, you go into the studio and you pick the worst microphone and the worst amp that they have to make it sound as horrible as you can. And I feel like that's like the antithesis of what we're doing in a way.
I was just going to say, I think that's very, very true. And I even in a very kind of clean recording setup, I will normally try and give myself an option for having something a little bit crazier, even if I don't end up using it. But I mean, 9 times out of 10, I do use it. I do end up using it, right? So I sort of make sure I've got the clean things that I need, make sure I've got like the bases covered. But then I would always do. So I was working with the choir, for example, on a Hackney Colliery Band thing. Did with this thing called Angelique Kidjo, and we had got the choir to do their stuff, which was great. They did really good takes, so I knew I had it. But there was still a bit of time, and like, can we just do a pass? I always basically will try and do a pass where everyone just goes a bit nuts and everyone loosens up. You're not trying to get it. It's not like red light fever where you're just trying to get the perfect thing. Like, no, just go crazy. And then at the end, like, let's have a big whoa, like a big cheer sort of whoop thing. And of course, that's the one we end up using 90% of that rather than any of the other takes. But you know that once you know that you've got what you need, you can try that crazy stuff. And also then, I wouldn't do this with Hackney Colliery Band, but again, if I was writing for telly or something, you know that you can fix it in the box, or you can get the kind of really good sounding stuff with the software, but what you can't get is that crazy thing, so like I will always put like what I call a crap mic on a drum kit in a really mad place. And you can sometimes just dial a bit of that in if you want a bit of vibe or a bit of craziness. Well, I was talking to a drummer friend over the weekend I was working with, and he puts a mic in his drums that are in storage on the shelf, And so they're all resonating in a mad way, and he puts just one
cool.
mic in that, and he might not use much, but he's got that option if he wants to be able to dial up the crazy.
It does feel like as things have, as our ability to have access to sort of all these tools and things that have been great for allowing us to have access to produce and play with music, so too has the potential for us to maybe lose some human aspect. And I wanted to just touch on one of the things that has made creating music the most accessible that I think you could imagine, which is the sort of AI tooling that exists now. And I just wanted to get your thoughts on what this does for music, what this does for kind of, we've spoken about the benefits of producing and being mindful with it. And now we're kind of able to produce it with a prompt.
You mean AI slop, Matt? You're saying it in a very nice way.
Yeah, AI slop.
AI slop.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's a very, very interesting development. It's like so much of AI stuff. It is a real sea change in terms of like our relationship with music, because the last few years, as we've been talking about, has been a gradual democratization of the ability to make music and record it and release it. But which has come at some cost, as we say, in that maybe we've lost some of the more playful, fun aspects of that of the music making process. But now we're in a situation where anyone can and does type into a box exactly what they want, and it will spit out, if you prompt it properly, some very credible stuff, right? So in a way, I don't want to talk about whether AI music sounds good or not, because it's sort of irrelevant. I think it does a lot of the time. It is pretty credible, and it's sort of irrelevant whether it sounds good or not, because it's going to get much better, right? So it's not an interesting debate to have about whether it currently sounds good or not. Much more important thing to think about is, like, now that anyone can make music for free. I mean, again, I'm not going to get into the ethics and legality of how it's done in terms of the AI systems, basically stealing everyone's music. But now that is possible, it is, I think, the absolute apex of the commodification of music that we've kind of been moving towards over the last number of decades. And I mean, it really, if you want to get highfalutin about it, you can sort of almost start that idea. The birth of that idea is really recorded music, full stop. When people are talking about music now, they're mainly talking about recorded music. They're mainly talking about what they're streaming or whatever, and that's cool. But what's happened is that focus on the recorded sound being being what music is meant that it's got more and more commodified over time. And so, for example, people go and see live gigs, particularly of big commercial artists. They want to hear as close as possible to what's on the record. Mm-hmm. So the record is the sort of text, that is what the song is. That process of starting out where you're able to record something and play it back, and now where it's got to, that has changed the way that that live music happens. Coming right back to what we were talking about at the beginning, where it's started out as a kind of community thing in caves. We're all participating in it, and it's changed very fundamentally in like Western capitalist culture. Has changed so far. It's so far removed from that. Now AI is the kind of ultimate extension of that, because now you can just say, well, I like this band, this band, this band, this band. Can you write me something that's a bit like that? That's going to that's sad, or that's about this subject, that's got these lyrics. That is still people uploading music that they have made, even if they've just made it by typing in a prompt to Spotify, and then Spotify distributing it. What I think is going to happen very, very soon is that these platforms are going to, if you say, I've got people coming over for dinner, I want some like background music, and here are the bands I like, so and so and so and so. You brief your AI about, it's got all this knowledge about you from your history or whatever, if you're listening to, and rather than giving you a kind of sample playlist of that you might like this since you listen to this, it will create music that will exist in that moment for that dinner party or whatever, and that won't exist again. and it will write it will create the music there, and then based on your AI chat history, and you say the guests that you've got coming, one of them likes Radiohead, one of them likes whatever, like it will curate some music that sounds enough like that as background music to be passable. And on one level, that's really depressing. But on another level, like if it's coming back to the thinking about the things of like the function of music, that background music like that, or like, those uses of music, because there's never been more uses of music in history than there have been now. Music is everywhere you go. It's in the lift and you're in hold. It's in every shop you go in. It's on the radio all the time. It's used for ads. It's used for, but it's also still used for ceremony and for ritual. It's still used for those things, and it's still used for entertainment. And people still go to see bands in pubs or those sorts of things. And so my hope is that what we're talking about with the playfulness and the live experience will have more of a premium on it, and that will feel like people. I don't think live music is going to stop because of AI. I think the people's relationship with recording music might be different, and that is something we can mourn or not. But like it might make the live experience feel like something more special, because it isn't commodified in that same way. It is people expressing themselves. There's a whole other debate we haven't got time for now, but about how those people doing the live shows afford to live. But that's also true of every other profession. So, in a sense, musicians aren't distinct in that. For example, I never use it for creative work. So I might use it to help me work through an idea, but I will never give it the thing and say, do the creative bit for me, because that is the fun bit. That's the bit I want to do. I don't want an AI to do the bit that I enjoy. I want it to do all the stuff I don't like in my accounts, and I want it to and or whatever, organize my diary, whatever, those sorts of things. This is where I think that interview with the chief exec of Suno, I think it was, saying, oh yeah, but making music's really hard. No one actually wants to make music. It's like, no, you fundamentally misunderstood. Music is hard, but people do want to make music, and they have done for the whole of human history. You absolute goon. So like that is the bit that people want to do. People don't want to have to flog it and market it, and that's the bit that's tedious. Any musician you talk to, no one wants to be doing that stuff. They have to, because otherwise it's not going to get heard. They're not going to, their career's going to suffer. But like the making music bit is the fun bit, and I think that's what we've got to try and refocus on when it comes to things like AI slop. Not whether AI slop's good or bad, because again, whether it's even if you don't think it's good now, and actually I think a lot of it is surprisingly impressive, but it's going to get better. I mean, sure, it's never going to. I don't think it can't create original music in quite the same way that I would in my studio necessarily, because it's not going to come up with the same ideas. Maybe my hope is that it will make things, particularly the kind of weirder end of things, feel like something more special. So again, this stuff I do with shells and electronics, I mean, no AI is going to be trained to produce a shells and electronics album, because there's no market for it. So but as a live experience, or as even on record, I'm working on a record of that stuff now. Like that is something that is at least unusual, and maybe there's a reason for that. But but like at least it is something that exists in a way that even if you could get a computer to do that, you probably wouldn't, because there's not the same commercial incentives for it as anything else. So my hope is that it has a kind of a side effect of reconnecting us with music, and it's why I've sort of made it my mission with things like the podcast, to try and get people to engage with music, even as non-musicians, especially as non-musicians actually, or like non-players, is to try and reconnect with exactly that, the more communitarian aspect of how we used to make music, and many people still do make music. It's not like that's gone away. It still exists if you sing in a choir, or singing along in a pub, or it's going to exist, but it's trying to deepen people's understanding and appreciation for it, because as the commoditization of it gets more extreme, as it is day by day, we can't fight the fact that that's happening. But what we can do is kind of engage with the bits that are human and aren't recreatable in that way.
Well, Steve Pretty, hopefully this conversation gets people to think about maybe taking a leaf out of our ancestral roots, experimenting with music more, appreciating it perhaps in a different way, in different settings, and just seeing it as something that you can be imperfect at. But it has been absolutely fascinating talking to you, and thank you so much for joining us on What We Did Before.
Thanks very much for having me. It's been my pleasure.
A massive thank you to Steve Pretty for joining us on the podcast. I'm Ollie.
And I'm Matt, and this has been What We Did Before. If you have any ideas for future episode, please let us know in the comments below.
And please do chuck us a subscribe if you can. It helps us out massively, and we will see you next time.